Okay. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again. Everyone hear me okay? The mic seems like it's on? Great news. Okay, well, thank you all for braving the storm and showing up here. It's true hardcore naturalist spirit. So, welcome back. I hope you all had a great weekend. This week, we're going to take a little bit of a deviation from sort of the theme we've been covering. We're not going to be covering a new biome today. Instead, we're going to be talking about the absolute most exciting aspect of any California ecosystem, which is, of course, scientific literacy, writing, and research. And I'm making a little bit of a joke there because I realize it sounds a little bit sort of boring and dull. But the fact is, it's actually really, really cool. Even if you're not a scientist, if you have no plans to be a scientist yourself, being able to look at and glean some basic information from scientific publications and primary sources, rather than just kind of looking like a wall of inscrutable information, it's really cool. Because it opens up this whole aspect, this whole sort of treasure trove of information. If you can kind of learn how to look at one of these documents, pull some basic meaning out of it without trying to understand all the statistical intricacies and everything like that, it can be really nice. And for you all, especially since you have an assignment on this quarter, it'll be nice to know a little bit more about how to kind of dive into those primary sources. So before that, a couple of announcements. As a reminder, your midterm is 1 week from today. So 7 days from today, you'll come in here in normal time, normal duration, and you'll just take the midterm in class. A couple of you mentioned that a study guide would be useful. So I wouldn't typically do a study guide for this class because it's team taught and it feels kind of tough to kind of distill specific subsets of what other people are presenting. But enough of you have mentioned that it would be useful that I will post a study guide tonight or tomorrow. It'll also just be a summary of the main themes of what we covered in our guest lectures, but I'll also put some sample questions, that sort of thing in there in case it's useful to see what to expect on the midterm. Sound good? Any questions on the midterm? Okay, fantastic. As a reminder too, now that we are getting into our first habitat account stuff, our first 2 writings, so the first 2 themes you have now been assigned, are due on the 16th. So just under 2 weeks from now. It's the end of the weekend. So you'll have a couple weeks, including it through the weekend, to get those 2 sections done. If you're one of the few folks left who's not been assigned a habitat account because you weren't able to turn in your outline or you joined late or something like that, please do get in touch with me and or your TA ASAP so we can kind of get you started on that. Because now is about the time where it would be wise to kind of start thinking about what you're going to write as opposed to just kind of generally looking at your habitat. Sound good to everyone? Cool. And then last but not least, on kind of a lighter, less administrative note, a few of you have mentioned that you're into kind of birds, that a lot of you are kind of budding or aspiring birders here. And it turns out that the wildlife department on campus has a birding club. It's pretty awesome. It's run by undergrads, including folks who are really, really keen birders. So if you have any interest in kind of sharpening your ID skills, getting the chance to go out and be a naturalist around here and elsewhere in the valley, take a look. I will put up an announcement about that on Canvas today, as well as an announcement about something that is new information to me too. There's also a club within the wildlife department called the Scientific Illustration Club. So if you're interested in sharing your art or sharpening your naturalist illustration skills, that might be a cool group to look at as well. So I'll post those on Canvas today, so please do take a look if that interests you at all. It's pretty fun, not a high pressure environment or anything like that. Any questions on this? All right, cool beans. So one thing that's very overdue is several weeks ago, we talked about an ecological mystery having to do with pronghorn. And vaguely recall that from a couple weeks ago, last time I had the floor and was giving this lecture. It's this kind of cool evolutionary mystery that we see sometimes where we tend to see prey species, especially in large animals, that evolve to be just a tiny little bit faster, just a little bit faster than their fastest predator species. So we call it an evolutionary arms race, where predator and prey evolve and adapt sort of in a race with one another to kind of outdo one another. An American pronghorn, this very unique species we see in California, were a mystery for a very long time because we clocked them, we'd measure them racing across these beautiful landscapes, and it turns out they were far and away, way faster than any predators that we would see going after them. And that was a weird kind of mystery to naturalists, right? Because why would this animal evolve to be so much faster than anything chasing it? It's a waste of energy, right? Why have all that extra muscle, extra tendon strength, extra metabolic efficiency when you only need to run this much faster than the thing that's trying to eat you? You ever heard of this mystery before? It's a little conundrum, because it turns out it's solved. It's kind of a cool one. Anyone heard what the answer to this one ended up being? Yeah, right here. Dead on. So it turns out this is a case where being naturalists helped us solve this mystery. Back a while ago at this point, we discovered, I say we as if I was there, Maracinonyx, which was an American cheetah that went extinct, one of our Pleistocene megafauna, right? So it turns out that the reason our pronghorn evolved to be so much faster is because there was a time, fairly recently in evolutionary history, that there was a predator that was just about as fast that could catch up with it. So that speed of the pronghorn is this kind of cool evolutionary relic that's sort of this echo, this leftover little piece of what things used to look like. I also absolutely love this illustration because I like that it presents you as a person. It also presents also you as a pronghorn, and it gives us an American cheetah that is absolutely 100% done with you. I really like that. Okay, so that's our mystery solved there. So let's actually get into what we're talking about today, which is scientific reading, research, and literacy, especially as it pertains to you all this quarter. So, key things that we're going to try to establish today in this lesson. We're going to try to give you guys the skill to assess a source, to look at and be able to determine, this seems like a primary source versus this might be secondary, this might not be reliable information, so on and so forth, right? We're going to talk about some resources, even specifically here at UC Davis, and believe it or not, even specifically for this class that the library and us have put together to help you out. We're going to talk about the writing pieces, so we'll actually spend some time today talking about some examples of pieces that have been done before by other students in the class and give you guys an idea. And then we'll talk a little bit with whatever time we have left. We'll read a couple of pieces of sample writing from your past colleagues, and we'll come up with some potential critiques of that. Sound good? All right. So, what is a primary source? You've had a couple of handouts so far that kind of discuss what a primary versus secondary versus et cetera source is. In short, a primary source is something that reports on data that it itself generated. It's not repeating information that someone else discovered or created or whatever the case may be. It says, we found this information, we ran the tests, we did the experiments, we took the measurements, and we're directly reporting it here. There's no sort of secondary game of telephone where someone is repeating it. It's not a news outlet reporting on the results of the study. It is the study itself, right? And so the most common thing we see on this is a peer-reviewed journal article. Who's heard that phrase before? It's kind of the gold standard of publications when it comes to science in a lot of fields, right? STEM and beyond. So peer-reviewed journal articles are far the most common. And these have very specific elements that make it a little bit easy to see. They'll always have an author list, the people who contributed to the creation of that data and the publication of that article, right? They'll certainly have a title saying, in often very hard to read terms, what the article does. It'll have an abstract, which is really critical. That'll have the actual publication and date and journal edition that it was published in. So if anyone wants to glance at this a second, take a look at this little cutout here and tell me if anyone can come up with which academic journal this article was published in. Take a second and look and raise your hand if you see it. Yeah, Ben? Exactly, so American Naturalist. So it can be a little bit funky because sometimes the titles are a little bit weird, or at least they don't seem like journal titles. It might just say Science, which is a very prestigious academic journal. But yeah, here we have the American Naturalist article, or edition 4 of the issue 131, published in 1988. It's not the freshest source, but might be really useful there, right? Does that make sense to everyone? More often, when we look at it online these days, we'll have a splash page. If we open up the PDF where it's actually stored, we'll see something like this, the actual document, but we'll see something like this. Still has the same components here, right? Title, authors, often the whole page will have, you know, your journal title, issue, et cetera. But this is what it looks like. This is a peer-reviewed journal. Who's seen a lot of these? I've seen a lot of academic journals, right? Okay, not a super new concept, but it's okay if it is, right? You'll learn kind of the stereotypical presentation of these things over time. And again, the key reason that we use these as the gold standard for scientific information, especially in biology, well, I don't know about that, but particularly in biology, is because they're what we call peer-reviewed. Who's heard of the peer review system? Yeah, okay, not that common, but it's the reason that we as scientists choose to really trust these as reliable information. Because not only do the people who authored this article, not only are they the ones who actually ran those tests, took those measurements, generated that data, but they went through the peer review process. So what happens with the peer review process is you get together with your co-authors, you say, wow, we did a great job. We discovered that all frogs have 5 legs. Congratulations, they don't. And we sent it to this prestigious journal, right? Let's say it's the American Naturalist. The American Naturalist editors don't just say, hey, great job, we publish it. They send it through what's called the peer review process. What they do is they kind of keep this huge database of people who are experts on a variety of subjects related to what they publish about. So the American Journal of Mammalogy might have this whole contact list for mammalogists. Ecological Modeling Journal might have a whole list of people who are really good at making ecological models, that sort of thing. And they say, okay, we're going to pick 4, 3, whoever many experts in this field, and we're going to send them this manuscript. We're going to say, hey, expert, you know about reinvading species, range expansion of the California sea otter. You've done work on sea otters for the last 20 years. What do you think of this manuscript? Is it legit? Are their methods good? Are the claims they make defensible based on their information? And these editors, these peer reviewers, go through and they give their comments to the article. They might say, absolutely, this is absolute horse crap, reject it immediately. Or they might say, this is great, publish it, it seems fantastic, they've done good work, so on and so forth. So it goes under review and scrutiny of people who are experts in the field and know their stuff. This is kind of the foundation of science. We choose to trust this. Folks who believe in science, I'm certainly one of those, because we trust in the peer evaluation process. This is why it's a primary source. Does that make sense to folks? Cool. Okay. That's not the only place we see primary sources. There are other things we consider primary sources that don't go quite through that much, but they're still sort of overseen by agencies and groups that we trust. And one of the most common ones for naturalist stuff, for ecology, is government reports. So groups like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, US Fish and Wildlife Survey, US Geological Survey, they're mandated, they're tasked with monitoring, measuring, managing all of our natural resources. And so as part of that, what they have to do, and tend to do it pretty well, is they will publish reports of how things are doing. We surveyed this and found this. We looked at the population of winter-run Chinook in the American River and we found this. And they will directly publish their finding and recommendations based on information, right? So for example, here's a report by Cal Fish and Wildlife, CDFW. Implications of importing American bullfrog into California. Really nasty invasive species, can completely extirpate native amphibian communities, right? So these are kind of our two main flavors of primary sources here. Peer-reviewed publication and government reports. Not just government. There are certainly publications by other organizations that can be primary sources. But for naturalism, these tend to be the two sources of direct primary information. One important exception here is personal accounts. So we'll talk about this in a little bit here. But if folks are doing their writing on, for example, indigenous history in California, there's historically a pretty rough bias in not presenting native stories and indigenous stories. That is changing, which is great. But often personal accounts, so direct testimony, you know, a filmed interview of someone who was actually there, whatever the event was, whether it's First Nations or otherwise, are often a reliable source for that. Counts as a primary source, someone who was there and observed it is speaking directly. Does that make sense? Excellent. So, what is not a primary source? And the short and disappointing answer is most books are often not a primary source. The reason being that books, even textbooks, are usually a synthesis of a bunch of other studies, reports, everything like that, to make things more convenient and more readable. That is fantastic, right? I love things that are readable. I love not having to wade through these kind of hard to read peer-reviewed journals when I'm trying to get information, and that's fantastic. But the problem is often the books themselves are not primary sources themselves, right? Often when we have something like a narrative, Cadillac Desert is a great book. I recommend folks read it if they get the chance. But it's a narrative, right? They're written by an author. The author has their own views. They have potentially a persuasive message. They're trying to get a point across. And so they're not necessarily being completely unbiased in the writing as we require from peer-reviewed journals, right? So individual biases, inaccuracies, whatever can get into this. It's not peer-reviewed by any means. Also, pretty much all websites. The exception being if they're reporting an article for an academic journal or hosting government reports, something like that. So unfortunately, as cool as it is, you can look at that article on expansion of sea otter ranges, that's fantastic. But if you go to, you know, myottermanifesto.biz and it says at the top line, otters are the best animal ever to exist, not necessarily a primary source, right? It is someone's personal opinion that has not been scrutinized by others who might have differing opinions. So hopefully that's not new information for you, but just FYI. Now, one quick thing here. Often, especially something like a textbook that is designed to be this sort of clearinghouse of information on the subject, will cite the sources that they use to make their claims. And that's key, right? Because it means these textbooks are still really, really useful, even if we can't always cite them directly as primary sources. Because all we have to do is look at this textbook, read a line that says, yellow-legged frogs in California have elongated legs that are particularly useful for jumping in this area. Source, Billings et al., 1989, right? All we have to do is go to the literature cited in that book, look up that article, and boom, there's our primary source. This textbook has done a really good job of collecting all these sources together so they're easier for us as individuals to find and sift through. Make sense? Fantastic. Okay, any questions on this stuff? Sort of the basics of what does or does not constitute primary sources here? Fantastic. Okay, who has used Google Scholar before? Okay, good, this is awesome, you guys are pros at this. But again, no sweat if you're not. So we're gonna take a second and do a little bit of a tour of Google Scholar here. So all that Google Scholar is, for anyone who's not familiar, is Google. It's a search engine, has all this good setup here. Yeah, fantastic. All right, check out my search history, at least I'm not ashamed of it. Right? So all it is a subset of Google where the algorithms only search for things that are, by and large, not entirely, but mostly, considered primary sources here, right? So Google Scholar is basically this Google system that subsets and only gives you academic, or at least very defensible and mostly primary sources, right? So let's say I'm interested in something specific. So someone give me an ecosystem. Oh, I believe in you guys. You can name an ecosystem. Wetlands, excellent. Okay, freshwater wetlands, and let's say wetlands, and let's say a lesser scaup, because they're a great animal, a bird duck, right? So I look up wetlands lesser SCOP. This is what I'm interested in learning about, right? And lo and behold, I have all of these mostly peer-reviewed articles. In fact, on this first page, it's entirely peer-reviewed articles. SCOP are great because a lot of people study them. So I see article titles. Wetland use and feeding by lesser SCOP during spring migration across the upper Midwest USA. Amphipods, land season impacts, lesser SCOP, et cetera, so on and so forth, right? And this is a list of peer-reviewed articles that have contained these search terms. You guys are very computer literate, generationally at least, which is awesome. So I imagine this idea of using a search engine is not exactly new to you. But there are a couple things we can do at Google Scholar that kind of help us get the most out of this information. So one thing we can do is sort the range. So if we're looking at only interested in new papers, we can set a custom date range, so only give me papers that have been published in the last 5 years, so on and so forth. And one really useful thing that can be very helpful is the cited by tab here. Anyone used this before? So when we write a peer-reviewed article, we have to cite the work that sort of makes us aware of the background knowledge on the subject we're writing about, right? So I'm not claiming that everything I say in my article about lesser SCOP is my own work. I'm citing, sort of giving credit to and saying this has been done scientifically, the work that came before me. And so when I cite a paper, I put it in my lit cited. But when a paper cites me down the road, it goes into the cited by list. And that's kind of nice because if you just read the article, obviously they're not editing the article in the future to say how many papers cited it, but on Google Scholar or a couple other articles, we can say, hey, there are 52 papers that cited this one that built on the work done by this paper, right? So if we're interested in finding something related that came after, that cited by button can be great. And awesome, wow. Sometimes we can even look at sort of how well received or how important or how foundational a study was based on how many times it got cited, right? So if a peer-reviewed paper came out in 1956 and 2 people cited it in the last 70 years, probably didn't make that much of a splash, right? But lo and behold, we have something here from 2012 that's already been cited by 92 other publications, right? Okay, people were reading that, people were interested. It sort of spurred some extra work. For really foundational papers, you might have hundreds or even thousands of citations. Yeah, Abby? That's a really good question. That comes up a lot. How old is too old when it comes to scientific publication, right? And the answer is, there is not a too old, right? There are kind of 2 thoughts on this. So, especially when we're doing something like adaptations in a vertebrate species, we've been studying vertebrates for a long time. So some of the foundational work, some of the original research that might have been done on a species you're interested in exploring was probably done a while ago, right? And so if you open up a peer-reviewed article, often what you'll find is that sort of the, let's take a look at spring migration of waterfowl, conservation perspective, right? It's like a review paper, it has a lot of sources. When you look at, let's see, this doesn't have the, well, I'll just say, when you look at the introduction, which we'll talk about in a second, of a scientific paper, and you check out their citations, you might see some of them are fairly old, right? This is a fairly recent paper, but it's citing papers from 1998, 1991, 1972, so on and so forth. These are these foundational papers that were sort of the first to discover big things. So we'd like to have those. We like to say, okay, this is kind of where this subject started, right? This is where it started off. That's kind of one half of the equation. But then we also want to have really recent papers. So we're not just saying, okay, this was studied in 1972, we're done, we discovered everything, nothing new, right? Because you're probably missing a lot of new discovery and nuance. So when we write papers, often we like to have both. We like to have sort of these older foundational papers that sort of establish new, well information. And we like to have more recent ones that say, okay, this is the state of knowledge now, much more recently. Does that make sense? It's a great question. Now, keep in mind, for your writings for this assignment, you're going to have, at minimum, 3 primary sources. So we're not expecting you to do a full literature review and find these foundational things. But keep in mind, if you have a very old paper, Troutman et al. In 1939, be responsible researchers. Read it and make sure that the claims they make haven't been debunked in the future 85 years. But don't be afraid to use older sources if they contain and discovered important information that's fundamental to what you're writing about. That make sense? Yeah, awesome. It's a great question. Okay, so that's kind of Google Scholar in a nutshell. If you do quick Google searches, there's all kinds of little YouTube videos and little hacks and stuff you can use to sort your citations. You sort of know the query language where if you put things in quotes, it will search the whole phrase instead of the component words. Things like putting your area in your search term is always useful. So saying like lesser SCOP California instead of just lesser SCOP might be useful, but I trust that you guys have kind of seen this before and know the basics. Any questions on using Google Scholar? It is, in short, a Google search, right? It's just limited to mostly primary sources. And now you guys kind of have this criteria of how to identify primary sources. Sound good? Fantastic. Okay. So, key takeaways here, right? It's better to spend a long time looking for the right article And it's grabbing the first article you see and really diving deep into it because it can be a lot of time wasted trying to understand these scientific articles and finding out, oh, this isn't really saying what I was hoping to discover from this article. So spend more time on Google Scholar, on sort of these other sources we'll talk about, rather than trying to just read papers one by one, right? The longer you spend making sure you found the right article that says what you were hoping to learn, the less time you'll spend trying to dig through some of the difficult to read portions of this article. Make sense? Cool. When you find cool articles, don't feel the need to read them word for word. I certainly don't, and I consider myself a pretty decent researcher, right? Scan articles. It's a really key thing. We'll talk a little bit about how to sort of save yourself some time and tears when you're trying to read a scientific article, but don't feel the need that to get the gist of an article, you need to word for word read the entire thing, because anyone who says they does is either lying or terrifying, and neither one of those is a good alternative. One thing that comes up on this assignment is keep in mind, if you find a cool article that talks about, for example, an adaptation on the species you want to study, but it was done outside of California, that's okay, right? The adaptation, unless it's a very local adaptation, which they will describe in the article, it's probably the same as what you see in California. So totally okay to use papers, articles, government reports, whatever, that came from outside of California, as long as it's relevant to the species, habitat, and theme that you're working on in California. Does that make sense to folks? Fantastic. Okay, so cool news for you all is that there is not just Google Scholar. For this class specifically, your instructors and the UCD library have actually put together a guide to doing research and finding primary sources for this class specifically. So if you check out that URL, I'm not going to take too much time to do it today, but take a look at that URL. It has access to a bunch of different databases, sort of publication warehouses that are kind of like Google Scholar. So if you kind of want to narrow it down, these are posted on Canvas, by the way, you can use these links and use that little guide that's been posted by the library online to help guide your research, sort of help your effort be as productive as it can be. Sound good? And this is not it, right? There's a lot of other resources when it comes to scientific research that aren't explicitly described here. Anyone heard of Web of Science? So Web of Science is a subscription-based service. Nice, we got a couple folks. The subscription-based service that the UC obviously has access to lets you fairly nuanced searches for specific articles. Google Scholar is awesome because it's very broad. It casts a wide net, but often you kind of have to get a lot of bycatch you didn't expect. Web of Science gives you really nuanced search options like year of publication, author name, journal specifically, exact keywords from the article, study methods. You can really sort of dial in and do a very laser-focused search. For your purposes, I don't think you would need all the tools for Web of Science, but it's something, if you're interested in doing this sort of more long-term, it's a really useful tool to know, right? If you're interested in looking at birds, there's a really cool resource called Cornell's Birds of the World. Have you heard of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology? It's a very prestigious ornithological lab in New York that runs a lot of ornithology stuff across the world. And they have this massive database where they invite academics to write sort of the overall ecological statistics information about many species of birds in the world. I think just about every California bird has a page there. It's qualified as a primary source because it is peer-reviewed. You can cite it just like you would an article. Do keep in mind, it's called Cornell Birds of the World. That's the very academic version. There's also Birds of North America, and we mess with that, which is kind of more of like a field guide type thing. Like here's your ID an acorn woodpecker or something like that. So just keep in mind, be a little bit careful about reading this up. There's also the Mammal Diversity Database, kind of similar idea, not quite as well developed as Cornell. It in of itself is not a primary source, but it has a lot of links to primary sources that have to do with specific species. Sound good? Okay, any questions about this so far? I know this is a ton of information. I'm not expecting you guys to memorize this right now, although I will expect to be able to ask you what is a primary source, and you should be able to tell me. But this is mostly a reference to have up on Canvas to kind of help and be an aid when you guys are writing your narratives, or not just narratives, but your habitat accounts. That sound good? Fantastic. Okay, so when it comes to actually reading an article, one of these scientific articles, it can be intimidating, right? Top carnivores increase their kill rates on prey as a response to human-induced fear. This is a great publication that came right out of UC Davis. Justine Smith is going to be giving a guest lecture in this course. She's mostly a mammal researcher in the wildlife department, but she does some really awesome research. So, one of the first places we always look when reading one of these scientific articles is the abstract. Have folks seen the abstract before? Yeah, abstract is something that just about every single scientific article will have. Sometimes it's called something a little bit different, like the summary or the executive summary or everything like that. But the abstract is something that has saved my butt a million times in the sense that it is designed to be a summary of the entire study, the entire article that was written here, that is written so someone who is not an expert in the subject can understand it, right? That ideally kind of gets a little bit pretentious in and of itself. We, as people who are not experts in that subject, should be able to read it start to finish and have a basic idea of what the study intended to do, what it did, what it found, and what that means, right? So in this case, we say, okay, fear induced by predators when their prey is well known to cause behavioral adjustments by prey that can ripple through food webs, right? Once you kind of parse that out, it makes a certain amount of sense, right? You can kind of get what they're trying to say. So the abstract is really critical. It can look different ways. It can kind of have different sort of formats and stuff. But keep in mind, it's always going to be at the top of the article and always going to have sort of this really identifiable block form. Make sense? All right. Every section, every other section of the article is kind of going to be summarized here. It should be this sort of very, very executive, hopefully succinct summary of the article. Again, this is where we always look first. So if I'm curious whether it's worth my time reading an article, I'll take a couple minutes, look through the abstract, say, huh, this seems relevant to what I want to learn about. Or, nah, doesn't seem like it's quite on my subject. I'll move on, right? Just about every article also has very specific sections, right? They can be named differently depending on the academic journal specifically, but it's going to be roughly the same structure. When we talk about academic journals and scientific publications, we talk about the hourglass format. Just about every article starts with an introduction. What do we know about the subject being studied here? What's unknown? Why are we doing this study, right? What are our goals? What's the background on our study? Why was it motivated? What are we trying to accomplish? That all comes in the introduction. It tends to be very broad. Kind of start with something really, really sort of nebulous. Foraging and acquiring food is important to animals. Lions are top predators in foraging ecology and have disproportionate effects on food webs. Lions in the sub-Saharan are poorly understood because of this, this, and this. We did this study in order to discover this aspect of lion foraging ecology, right? Starting very broad and then getting narrower and narrower until you really zero in on what you did for your study. Then, methods. One of the critical parts of science as a whole is that every piece of science that is done should be replicable by your colleagues, peers, and people 6 generations from now. In an ideal world, people should be able to replicate your methods and find the same results. Never works out that way, but that's just the real world when it comes to ecology. So the methods are your very specific recipe of how the study was done. When it comes to gleaning information, I don't tend, and a lot of folks don't tend to zero in on the methods too much, right? They tend to be very, very specific because the goal is that anyone who wants to should be able to replicate the study based on the methods. So it gets really, really deep into things like exactly how we trapped the lions, exactly what molecular laboratory techniques were used to extract DNA from the feces, exactly what statistical tests were used to generate the results. And if I'm just trying to figure out something fairly general from that article, I don't necessarily need that. If you're someone who's really trying to replicate or create a similar experiment, that stuff's gold, right? It saves you as a naturalist from having to replicate that experimental design entirely. But if I just want to know what was in the lion poop, I don't need to know the statistical tests they used to generate it, right? So the method section, really useful, but something I tend to gloss over. I'm just looking for a summary of main findings of an article. The results are, in short, what did the study find? And this is actually a little bit misleading sometimes because the purpose of the results is to present the findings of the study with no interpretation whatsoever. Hard numbers and data. We found antelope DNA in 57% of lion poop. No interpretation of that, no discussion of the meaning, what it means for conservation, anything like that, right? Where we really see the meat of things is the discussion. This tends to be the largest section of a scientific article. It's what do those results mean? Well, this means that lions in the sub-Saharan Africa seem to prey primarily on antelope, right? Some actual interpretation of the cold, hard numbers from the results. Often, we'll see something like a conclusion. Sometimes it's incorporated into the discussion, but it'll say, why do these matter? What's the meaning of this, right? What is the implication for conservation or science? What's next? What questions arise from this work? So this is kind of the structure. When it comes to reading a scientific article, kind of trying to figure out if it has useful applications for what you want to write about, abstract's always first. Abstract's kind of your little peek and ideally summary of what that whole article is about, but then there are a couple things we tend to look at. The end of introduction tends to describe what exactly the study does. The results, as much as you can interpret them, because with advanced statistics these days, it can be hard to read when you're not an expert. And then the start of the discussion tend to be the best places to look. The start of the discussion, often the first sentence is usually kind of this thesis statement on what our results mean. We believe that our results suggest that conservation should be taken to save the hellbender salamander in this region because A, B, and C, right? It's an interpretation, kind of the one key sentence we want to take you away tends to be in the first couple sentences of discussion, right? So again, when I read an article, I'm not reading the whole thing word by word. I look at the abstract, I might read the introduction, then I jump to the results, look at their pretty plots and figures, see what they found, and then read a little bit of the discussion. If I need to learn more, if I want to replicate their experiment or cite it, something like that, I might dive deeper into it. But when I'm doing my research, when I'm kind of looking around for interesting stuff, that's how I and most folks tend to read academic journal articles. Yeah? Cool. And that's really, really helpful, because if I see a 37-page paper on, methylation of, or epigenetic methylation of, genome 674C on this species as a result of, maternal effects, that is just a wall of text to me. Unless you are an expert in that, it can be really, really hard to understand all the little niche statistics and methods. So having the skills to be able to find a scientific paper that's outside of your expertise and glean the key points from it unlocks this entire world of scientific literature. For me, I've been doing this for a while now, and for me, a lot of these scientific articles can look like absolute nothing. They look like a wall of text, and I have no idea what 3/4 of it means. But the ability to kind of reach into that bag of chaff, which is a disservice to a lot of authors, and pull out kind of the key golden nuggets within there, makes it a lot easier to do research. So it is a really worthwhile skill in a world where finding subjective truth can be really, really hard to find. Does that make sense? Cool. A couple little tips. Some of these services, especially peer-reviewed journals, it's kind of a shitty thing about science, require subscriptions, right? So these journals charge a ton of money to academic institutions to be blessed with the golden light of their research. It's something that a lot of academics are really annoyed about. It presents a lot of equity and access issues. But if you're doing research off campus, you may need to use a VPN. So there is a site on UC Davis. Anyone used their VPN before? Really easy to set up. You install a little client and say, okay, I recognize you are a computer that has a UCD subscription to get access to these journals. So if you're at home trying to access a journal, it's like pay $300 for access to this PDF. I expect you to pay the $300. No, I'm just kidding. You have to just access through a VPN, so keep that in mind. Right? Sometimes now you'll see a little UC Davis button or something like that gives you the single sign-on with that whole duo identification thing. But just keep in mind, if you're doing research off campus, that may be an extra step you have to take. Pretty easy to do, but let me know if you have any questions. Easy peasy. Okay, any questions about research in general? Congratulations, you're all experts. I expect your PhD theses in 3 weeks. Fantastic. Okay, so now let's talk about how this pertains to you. So for your first submission, you guys have all been assigned, and again, if you haven't yet, make sure to get in touch with me or TA soon. You'll write 2 separate pieces that are focused on different themes related to your assigned habitat. Does that sound familiar to people? Ring a bell? So, for example, one of our themes is a conservation management plan for an endangered or threatened species within your habitat, right? So if you're doing coast redwoods, this could be spotted owl. If you're doing deserts, this could be the desert tortoise. All kinds of different choices there, right? So when you do this, it's going to be a description of key conservation challenges, a couple, and what you might do to help with that. Also, what is being done to help with that currently, right? Keep in mind, because your writing assignments are 400 to 600 words each, you're not going to be able to do a comprehensive description of all of the conservation challenges faced by the northern spotted owl, for example. So pick a single aspect of conservation challenge that you think is interesting, something like the invasion of barred owls, sort of the spotted barred owl conflict. Oh man, that's one to look up. We may talk about that in our Coast Redwood lecture. People are shooting owls with shotguns for conservation. Sounds counterintuitive, but it's a really fascinating ethical debate as naturalists. So for example, someone might do, hey, California tiger salamanders face conservation challenges due to hybridization, right? In grasslands habitat, we have our tiger salamanders. We're talking about a conservation management plan, right? So here we have a paragraph on the tiger salamander, specific description of a widespread threat, including a parenthetical citation of a peer-reviewed article. So I say something that is a specific number. It is defalsifiable, it is either true or not true, and I cite my source as to where I got it, which is a primary source, right? Article like that. Then the potential theme, adaptation, right? A lot of animals in their biomes have really cool adaptations. We've talked about a lot of them. Everyone ever seen a kangaroo rat? Oh, they're very, very cute. Go to the Mojave at night, you'll see them hopping around, running away from headlights. Very, very sweet, right? And some of these are really interesting. They have fascinating adaptations to their habitat. Kangaroo mice almost never drink. It's crazy. They're really efficient metabolisms when it comes to water. They get some metabolic water from the foods they eat. And so despite being in the desert, they almost never have to find water, which is good because it's a desert. Someone might do an article on that, right? Hey, deer mice adaptations and climate. I'm doing my report on chaparral and coastal sage scrub adaptation, right? Deer mice in California coastal sage scrub are interesting because they have an important role in the ecosystem as dispersing seeds and being prey for other species, right? So we might talk a little bit about they must be resilient to varying conditions, hot and cold on the California coast, right? Dry and wet. And so here are a couple articles I read talking about those adaptations. Make sense? We're not limited to just doing the vertebrate stuff. This is a vertebrate course, but several of you have signed up to do a non-animal theme, right? So for example, I might be interested in chemical composition of things like really unique lakes. Who's been to Mono Lake? Seen the tufas up there. Really, really unique and cool ecosystem in California. These mineral spires that have just built up over time due to this really bizarre concentration of alkalines and salts in this lake, right? So things like climate, vegetation, soil types, many of these broad scale and more refined state variables we talked about earlier in the class. You might do a whole report on, what things look like, high pH in Mono Lake, creating this unique ecosystem that specific vertebrates survive in. Does that make sense? Cool. One of the slightly more unusual ones that sort of deviates from that sort of structure is a narrative, right? We're not just scientific writers. We can write a narrative style too. That's what naturalists did. That's how we have a lot of our really old school descriptions of ecosystems in California. There's a really famous ecologist named Joseph Grinnell who in the 30s was in the Davis area writing about what they found. And he has these journals about, oh yeah, we walked down Poudre Creek for 2 days today and we hardly went 4 minutes without seeing a grizzly bear. Most of them ran away from us, but a couple were aggressive, right? And so these narrative style naturalist notes are really, really cool and provide us a lot of insight through their detailed study of what things were like back in the day. So some of you are doing a narrative, right? So actually looking as if, sometimes as if you were out there, but observations of habitats or specific species, group of species, right? So either write as, if you're actually out there doing it, a narrative observer, or write as if you were out there, even if you're not. If you're doing grizzly bears, please don't try to track them down. Yeah, Abby. Welcome to my trap. Right, so if you do a piece in the style, keep in mind, you won't do in-text citations, those parentheticals we would for the others, but instead, after your narrative paragraph, you'll write a few sentences, 3 to 5 sentences, describing how you did your research and gained the information necessary to write a narrative piece from an informed perspective. Does that make sense? Cool. Is that a question back there? Yeah, often you'll be first observer, or first person rather. If you want to write it as a cameraman, that's awesome, right? If you're specifically thinking as someone trying to document this, that's really cool. Often we'll write it as a scientist saying, I am out here, I am curious, I found these tracks, I found this otter, so on and so forth, right? Kind of making sense to folks. But hey, really key thing, if you have an idea to make this your own, to say, this is cool, but maybe I could twist it in this way, let us know, because heck, I think it'd be awesome. So we're definitely open to this. And heck, even more broadly, if you see these themes and like, these are all pretty cool, but I have a really good idea of how I might do this. I can make a short film, something like that. That's cool as hell. Let us know, right? We'd be probably really happy to accommodate that. Unless your idea is like, I want to sleep for 10 hours and dream about it and then write my dream journal. That's awesome, but not quite in the theme of the direct natural observations. Make sense? Right, so an example here, first paragraph, describing a naturalist account of something like a varied thrush around here, plenty of options. We also have our human history, right? So describing how humans have interacted with the habitat that you're assigned to over time, right? Often, but not necessarily by any means. This is from a sort of related to First Nations and sort of pre-colonial times, but whatever you decide on. Certainly settlers, missionary era, that sort of thing. Key thing, obviously human history can be quite a bit more sort of sensitive and touchy. If you say, derogatory things about the California pocket mouse, it's probably not gonna be super upset. It's just gonna go and not drink water for a couple weeks. But when you talk about people, especially marginalized groups like indigenous peoples about California, do realize you're talking about extant groups of people, and please use appropriate language for that. So things that can come up sometimes is do things like, be careful not to write in the past tense about native tribes in California, because they're still around. They are existing cultures that are hanging on. And be courteous, make sure you look up appropriate terminology, how these groups prefer to be referred to, both in terms of, ethnicity, group, nations, tribe, that sort of thing. Luckily, there are really great native-derived resources for this. So take a look at these things and just make sure if you write about these historically marginalized groups, you're doing so conscientiously in a way that sort of respects the history there. Sound good? Excellent. Okay, last but not least, quick thing, plagiarism and citations. Be careful of that. Plagiarism is usually pretty straightforward. If you copy-paste from someone's words, that's plagiarism, right? But it can be a little bit more nuanced than that. So a quick 4-minute video that kind of gives you an overview of what does or does not constitute plagiarism in academia. So just watch that, make sure you're avoiding it, that sort of thing. Your writing should obviously need it be in your own words. If something that is your idea is written on the page, that's great. Don't need to cite yourself, obviously. But if you use anyone else's ideas that have been written about, make sure you give them credit for the hard work they did. That's how science works, right? So, one thing in science, we don't use big, 3-4 line quotes and quotations. We just don't. We paraphrase other thoughts. You can use a quick quote if there's a term or something like that's used, but don't copy and paste big chunks of text, even if it's in quotes. It's not plagiarism per se, it's just bad style for science. Make sure you are accurate in your citations, because misrepresenting a citation, using the wrong citation, takes credit away from the people who generated that information, and it's still outside of academic integrity. Honest mistakes, honestly, you'll get a chance to have us and your peers review your first drafts, so we're not gonna come down and bring academic conduct on you on your first draft. But as scientists, we have a responsibility to cite our peers and colleagues responsibly. Make sense? Cool, that's all I got today. Thanks for being patient with me up to the end there. I really appreciate that. I have office hours today, so if anyone has any questions or issues on this stuff, please let me know. You can also email me. And one last thing, if you haven't been assigned your Habitat account, please get in touch with us soon. Sound good? Awesome. Thanks, folks.